c4. English opening. Opening line. The English opening move avoids a number of black defenses and proceeds on the more deliberate idea of counterattacking in the center, often in conjunction with fianchettoing both bishops. e5. English opening. Opening line. The 1e5 variation treats the defense as if it were a Sicilian in reverse. g3. English opening. Accelerated fianchetto variation. Opening line. Consistent with the strategy of central light square control, but knight c3 first is more flexible. c6. Out of opening book. Knight f6 would have been in the English opening. Accelerated fianchetto variation. Book opening. Knight f3 threatens black's pawn at e5. e4 moves it to safety and threatens white's knight at f3. Knight d4 moves it to safety. d5 attacks white's pawn at c4. c takes d5. Queen takes d5, threatens white's knight at d4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight c2 moves it to safety. Knight f6. Knight c3 threatens black's queen. Queen e5 moves it to safety. Bishop g2 enables the short castle. Knight a6. a3. Knight c5 takes the knight away from the edge of the board. b4 attacks black's knight at c5. Knight b3 moves it to safety and threatens white's rook at a1. Rook b1 moves it to safety and attacks black's knight at b3. Knight takes c1. Queen takes c1. White wins a knight for a bishop. Material is even. Bishop e7 enables the short castle. Knight e3 blocks black's pawn at e4. Bishop e6 enables the long castle. Queen c2. Bishop d5. Knight c takes d5. c takes d5. Black wins a knight for a bishop. Material is even. Queen a4 check. Checks black's king. King f8 moves it out of check. Castle kingside. g6. d3. a6. d takes e4, isolates black's pawn at d5. d takes e4. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight c4 threatens black's queen. Queen e6 moves it to safety and threatens white's knight. Queen b3 removes the threat on white's knight. Rook e8. Knight d2. Bishop d8. Queen takes e6. Rook takes e6. Black wins a queen for a queen. Material is even. E3. King G7. Rook F C1 takes control of the open file. Rook H E8. Rook C8. Rook D6 attacks White's knight. Knight B3 moves it to safety. Rook E7. A4. Knight D5 threatens White's pawn at B4. Rook D1 pins Black's knight. Bishop C7 frees Black's knight from the pin. Knight C5. Slightly better is Bishop F1. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends bishop to F1. You move your bishop to F1. Black answers with pawn to F5. You move your knight to C5, which attacks Black's pawn at B7. Black answers with knight takes pawn at B4, which attacks your rook at D1 and isolates your pawn at A4. Your rook takes bishop, which partially pins Black's rook at E7 and forks Black's rook at E7 and Black's rook at D6. Black responds with rook at E7, takes rook, which removes the threat on Black's pawn at B7 and threatens your knight. Your rook takes rook. Black responds with rook takes knight. You move your rook to D7, which forks Black's king and Black's pawn at B7. Black counters by moving the king to H6, which moves it out of check. Your rook takes pawn at B7, which attacks Black's knight and isolates Black's pawn at A6. Black answers with pawn to A5, which protects Black's knight. You move your bishop to E2. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a rook, a bishop, and a pawn for a rook, a knight, and a pawn. In addition, the mobility of Black's pieces is decreased. Also, Black's pawn structure is slightly weaker. Rook D1 pins Black's knight. Bishop C7 frees Black's knight from the pin. Knight C5. Slightly better is Bishop F1. Knight B6 forks White's rook at C8 and White's rook at D1. Rook takes D6. Bishop takes D6. Removes the threat on Black's pawn at B7. Rook D8 moves it to safety and attacks Black's bishop. Bishop takes C5, forks White's pawn at A4 and White's pawn at B4. B takes C5, attacks Black's knight. Knight takes A4, threatens White's pawn at C5, and creates a passed pawn on A6. Black wins a rook, a knight, and a pawn for a rook and a bishop. Rook C8 removes the threat on White's pawn at C5. A5 pushes the passed pawn. C6. B takes C6, creates a passed pawn on C6. Rook takes C6. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Knight B2 takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Rook A6 threatens Black's pawn at A5 and moves it behind the passed pawn at A5. A4 moves it out of immediate jeopardy and pushes the passed pawn. Bishop F1. Rook B7. Bishop E2. Rook B3. King F1. A3 advances the passed pawn. King E1. Knight D3 check, checks White's king. Bishop takes D3, protects White's king and attacks Black's pawn at E4. Rook takes D3, removes the threat on Black's pawn at E4. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. G4. Rook B3. G5. Rook B1 check, checks White's king. King E2 moves it out of check and attacks Black's pawn at A3. Rook A1 protects Black's pawn at A3. Rook A7 pins Black's pawn at F7. King F8 frees the pin on Black's pawn at F7. Rook A4 attacks Black's pawn at E4. A2 pushes the passed pawn. H4. King G7. Rook A7 pins Black's pawn at F7. H5. Rook A6. Rook H1 threatens White's pawn at H4 and adds a promote threat at A2. Rook takes A2, removes the promote threat at A2. Rook takes H4, creates a passed pawn on H5. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Rook A5. Rook G4. Rook E5 leads to H4. Rook D5. Rook G1. Rook E5. H3. Rook takes E4. H2. Rook H4. H1. Queen. Rook takes H1. Rook takes H1. King D3. King F8. King E4. King E7. King E5. Rook H3. King D4. Better is F4, leading to H4, Rook A1, Rook G2, check, King F1, H3, Rook C1, Rook H2, King G1, Rook E2, Rook C3, King F8, Rook A3, King E7, Rook A7, check, King E6, Rook A6, check, King F5, Rook F6, check, King G4, which gains a rook and loses two pawns by comparison. This was White's only meaningful error. Even though the game was within reach here, White eventually resigned. h4 pushes the passed pawn. Rook a5. h3 leads to rook a1, rook takes g5, rook h1, rook h5, king f1, g5, king g1, g4, king h2, king g6, rook d1, king g5, rook d7, king f6, rook c7. Better is rook g1, leading to rook a4, h3, rook takes e4, h2, rook h4, h1, queen, rook takes h1, rook takes h1, king d3, king f8, king e4, king e7, f3, king e6, f4, rook d1, which gains a rook and loses 3 pawns by comparison. Rook a1. Rook takes g5. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by 2 pawns in material. Rook h1 attacks Black's pawn at h3. Rook h5 removes the threat on Black's pawn at h3 and moves it behind the passed pawn at h3. King f1. King f6. King g1. King f5. King h2 blocks Black's pawn at h3. King g4. Rook c1. King f3 attacks White's pawn at f2 and blocks White's pawn at f2. Rook c2 removes the threat on White's pawn at f2. f5. Rook a2. g5. Rook b2. g4. Rook a2. Leads to f4. E takes f4. e3. f5. e2. Rook takes e2. King takes e2. King g3. Rook takes f5. f4. G takes f3 en passant. King g4. f2. King takes f5. f1. Queen check. King e5. h2. King e6. h1. Queen. King e7. Queen d5. Much better is King g1, leading to f4, rook b7, h2, check, king h1, king takes f2, rook g7, f takes e3, rook f7, check, king e1, rook f3, e2, rook a3, g3, rook takes g3, king d1, rook e3, e1, queen, check, rook takes e1, check, king takes e1, which gains 2 queens and loses a rook and 2 pawns by comparison. Rook h8. Look out! Leads to rook a5. King takes f2. Rook takes f5. Check. King takes e3. Rook g5. Rook f8. Rook takes g4. King f3. Rook g1. King f2. Rook a1. e3. King takes h3. e2. King g4. e1. Queen. Rook takes e1. King takes e1. Much better is f4, leading to E takes f4, e3, f5, e2, rook takes e2, king takes e2, king g3, rook takes f5, f4, g takes f3, en passant, king g4, f2, king takes f5, f1, queen, check, king e5, h2, king e6, h1, queen, king e7, queen d5, which gains 2 queens and loses a rook by comparison. King g1 leads to f4, rook a5, h2, check, king h1, king takes f2, rook g5, g3, rook g4, rook d8, rook takes f4, check, king e2, rook f1, rook h8, rook c1, g2, check, king takes g2, h1, queen, check, rook takes h1, rook takes h1, king g3, king takes e3. Better is rook a5, leading to king takes f2, rook takes f5, check, king takes e3, rook g5, rook f8, rook takes g4, king f3, rook g1, king f2, rook a1, e3, king takes h3, e2, king g4, e1, queen, rook takes e1, king takes e1, which gains a pawn. Rook d8 leads to rook a5, rook d1, check, king h2, king takes f2, rook takes f5, check, king takes e3, rook c5, king f4, rook c6, rook d2, check, king g1, e3, rook c4, check, king g3, rook c1, e2, rook c3, check, king h4, king f2, h2, rook c7, e1, queen, check, king takes e1, h1, queen, check, king takes d2. Better is f4, leading to rook a5, h2, check, king h1, king takes f2, rook g5, g3, rook g4, rook d8, rook takes f4, check, king e2, rook f1, rook h8, rook c1, g2, check, king takes g2, h1, queen, check, rook takes h1, rook takes h1, king g3, king takes e3, which gains 2 rooks and loses a queen by comparison. Rook a1, danger, leads to f4, e takes f4, e3, king h2, e takes f2, rook a3, check, king takes f4, rook a4, check, king f3, rook a3, check, king e2, rook a1, rook d1, rook a6, rook h1, check, king g3, rook g1, check, king h4, f1, queen. Much better is rook a5, leading to rook d1, check, king h2, king takes f2, rook takes f5, check, king takes e3, rook c5, king f4, rook c6, rook d2, check, king g1, e3, rook c4, check, king g3, rook c1, e2, rook c3, check, king h4, king f2, h2, rook c7, e1, queen, check, king takes e1, h1, queen, check, king takes d2, which gains a rook and a pawn. Rook d2, ouch, leads to rook a5, h2, check, king takes h2, g3, check, king h3, g takes f2, rook takes f5, check, king takes e3, king g2, king e2, rook f4, e3, rook f3, king e1, king g3, f1, queen, rook takes f1, check, king takes f1, king f3. Much better is f4, leading to e takes f4, e3, king h2, e takes f2, rook a3, check, king takes f4, rook a4, check, king f3, rook a3, check, king e2, rook a1, rook d1, rook a6, rook h1, check, king g3, rook g1, check, king h4, f1, queen, which gains a queen and a pawn and loses a rook by comparison. Rook a5 threatens black's pawn at f5. Rook d1, check, yikes, leads to king h2, king takes f2, rook takes f5, check, king takes e3. Much better is h2, check, leading to king takes h2, f4, e takes f4, g3, check, king h3, g takes f2, rook a1, e3, king h4, e2, rook a3, check, king takes f4, rook a4, check, king e3, rook a3, check, rook d3, rook a6, e1, queen, rook e6, check, king d2, rook takes e1, f takes e1, queen, check, king g5, which gains a queen and a rook and loses 3 pawns in comparison. Black had a 1 game before this error, but it was not costly. White later resigned. King h2. Forced, moves it out of check, threatens black's pawn at f5, and blocks black's pawn at h3. King takes f2. Attacks white's pawn at e3, creates a passed pawn on g4, and isolates white's pawn at e3. Rook takes f5, check, checks black's king, and isolates black's pawn at e4. King takes e3. Creates a passed pawn on e4. Black wins 2 pawns for a pawn. Black is up 3 pawns in material. Rook f8. Leads to rook d2, check, king g3, rook g2, check, king h4, h2, rook f1, rook g1, rook takes g1, h takes g1, queen, king g5, king f3, king f6, queen c5, king f7, g3, king e6. Better is rook g5, leading to rook d2, check, king g1, king f4, rook h5, e3, king f1, h2, king e1, g3, rook h8, g2, rook f8, check, king g5, rook g8, check, king f6, rook f8, check, king g7, rook g8, check, king f7, rook f8, check, king takes f8, which gains a queen and loses a rook and a pawn by comparison. Rook d2, check, checks white's king.